Today, billions of people wake up every morning, go to work, attend meetings, reply to emails, complain about management, and count down the days until payday. It's such a normal part of life that we rarely stop to ask a simple question. Who was the first person to have a job? Not a king, not a warrior, not a farmer trying to survive. An actual professional. Someone whose full-time responsibility was doing one specific thing for society. Who was the world's first office worker, the first accountant, the first teacher, the first manager, and perhaps most importantly, who was unlucky enough to become the first tax collector? Today we're traveling thousands of years into the past to meet the people who invented having a career. And trust me, some of their workdays were surprisingly familiar. Before we begin, consider subscribing. Making videos is a lot of work. And unlike today's professions, I have absolutely no idea who invented content creation. Whoever it was, they owe me an explanation. Because unlike many ancient workers, I unfortunately do not accept payment in beer, although I'm open to negotiations. Now let's meet the first people who had jobs. The first office workers. Let's start with a profession that might feel painfully familiar. Office workers. The world's first office workers appeared in ancient Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. They were called scribes. Imagine showing up to work one morning. No laptop, no internet, no coffee machine, no standing desk, just a pile of wet clay and a sharp stick. That was the office. Scribes spent their days recording information. How much grain entered the warehouse? Write it down. How many sheep belonged to a farmer? Write it down. Who paid taxes? Write it down. Who still owed taxes? Definitely write that down. In many ways, scribes were ancient database administrators. They stored information that kept entire cities functioning. Without records, nobody knew who owned what. Nobody knew how much food was available, and governments couldn't manage anything. The funny thing is that humanity invented paperwork almost immediately after inventing civilization. Apparently, the first thing we did with writing wasn't poetry, it was bureaucracy. Some traditions never die. The first accountants. But recording information wasn't enough. Someone also had to count everything, and that's where accountants entered the story. If civilization had a secret superhero, it was probably an accountant. Because once people started farming, cities suddenly had enormous amounts of stuff. Grain, animals, taxes, trade goods, warehouse inventories, debts, resources. Someone had to keep track of all of it. Ancient accountants spent their days counting and recording everything imaginable, and surprisingly, some of humanity's oldest written documents aren't stories, they aren't laws, they aren't military records, they're basically receipts. Imagine surviving underground for 4,000 years, only for archaeologists to discover that your greatest contribution to history was documenting 6 goats and 12 bags of grain. History can be brutal. Yet accountants were absolutely essential. Without them, governments couldn't collect taxes, merchants couldn't trade efficiently, and cities couldn't function. Civilization wasn't built on swords, it was built on people who were weirdly good at counting. The first teachers. Of course, accountants don't magically appear, someone has to teach them. Which brings us to teachers. The moment writing became important, education became important. Ancient schools began appearing to train future scribes and government officials. Students spent years memorizing symbols, practicing writing, and learning complicated systems, and according to surviving evidence, students hated school just as much as they do today. Imagine studying for years just to learn hundreds of writing symbols. No graduation ceremony, no motivational speeches, just more symbols. Archaeologists have even found ancient homework exercises filled with mistakes and corrections, which means somewhere in Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago, a student looked at an assignment and thought, "This is never going to be useful." History suggests they were wrong, but they definitely thought it. Humanity changes, students don't. The first merchants. But while teachers were educating the next generation, another group was getting rich. Merchants. Long before online shopping, long before cargo planes, Long before next day delivery, there were merchants. These traders traveled huge distances carrying valuable goods between cities and kingdoms: copper, tin, jewelry, textiles, food, luxury goods, and pretty much anything people wanted. Their journeys could take weeks, sometimes months, and unlike modern business trips, they were genuinely dangerous. Bandits, storms, pirates, disease, getting lost, all part of the job description. Modern salespeople worry about quarterly targets. Ancient merchants worried about pirates stealing everything they owned. Different workplace, same stress. Merchants connected civilizations. They spread ideas, technologies, and products across vast distances. Without merchants, many ancient cultures would never have interacted. History often celebrates conquerors, but merchants may have changed the world just as much. The first managers. As civilizations grew larger and more complicated, another profession became necessary: managers. Because whenever humans gather in large groups, management eventually appears. It's basically a law of nature. Ancient managers organized workers, assigned tasks, tracked supplies, monitored progress, and answered questions from people above them. In other words, they spent a lot of time explaining why things weren't finished yet. If you've ever worked on a delayed project, congratulations. You already understand ancient management. Imagine overseeing the construction of a giant temple. Hundreds of workers, thousands of materials, constant logistical problems, and every few days a ruler asking, "Is it done yet?" Some workplace experiences truly transcend time. Ancient managers quickly learned a lesson that modern managers still learn today: everything takes longer than expected. The first engineers. Speaking of large projects, let's talk about engineers. Engineers are the people who looked at impossible problems and somehow found solutions. Cities needed roads, walls, canals, temples, irrigation systems, and massive monuments. Engineers figured out how to build them without calculators, without computers, without software, without YouTube tutorials. Imagine looking at a 50-ton stone block and confidently saying, "We should move that," then actually succeeding. Ancient engineers redirected rivers, transported enormous materials, and created structures that still exist thousands of years later. That's impressive, especially considering some modern websites crash if too many people visit at once. Every civilization eventually discovers two things: taxes and construction projects that become much more complicated than expected. The first tax collectors. Which brings us to our final profession, the villains of today's story: tax collectors. The moment governments realized they could collect resources from citizens, tax collectors appeared, and they've never really left. Ancient taxes came in many forms: grain, animals, silver, labor, whatever the government needed. Tax collectors traveled around making sure everyone paid their share, which made them incredibly important. It also made them incredibly unpopular. Imagine introducing yourself at a party. "Hello, I'm a tax collector." Conversation over. Some professions earn admiration, some earn respect. Tax collectors mostly earn complaints, and somehow that tradition has survived for thousands of years. But before we end, there's one final surprise. Many ancient workers were paid, not always with money, sometimes with food, sometimes with grain, sometimes with clothing, sometimes with housing, and very often, beer. Yes, beer. Imagine waiting for payday and receiving several gallons of beer instead of a direct deposit. Ancient payroll was apparently much more interesting than modern payroll. The form of payment changed, the excitement of payday did not. And that's really the story of humanity's first jobs. The first office workers didn't have computers. The first accountants didn't have calculators. The first teachers didn't have textbooks. The first managers didn't have spreadsheets. The first engineers didn't have software. And the first tax collectors didn't have online payment systems. But they were already dealing with many of the same things we deal with today: paperwork, deadlines, management, taxes, and waiting for payday. 3,500 years later, humanity is still running basically the same system. We've upgraded the technology, but somehow the paperwork survived. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, it helps more than you think, especially since no ancient king is sponsoring this channel yet. And if you want more videos like this, I'll see you in the next one, hopefully before your next meeting starts. Thanks for watching.